LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains references to suicide. If this content does affect you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. Also, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are warned that this episode contains references to and the names of deceased persons.
A case that started a manhunt and ended in tragedy. A quiet town in the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney, thrown into chaos by a shooting and the police's effort to track down the offender. Alan Leek is a 35-year veteran of the New South Wales Police. He spent almost his entire career as a detective. For much of his life, violent crime was on his doorstep, and it was up to him to take it on, whilst balancing life, family, and more. In this rewind episode of Crime Insiders, we begin with a horrific double murder in the Blue Mountains.
Could you walk us through that case? It's going back a year or two.
Yeah, well, I've got fairly vivid memories of that, but it was a man who, Neville Constable, his name was, and he was getting ready to go to work. He worked on the railways, and he was getting ready to go to work, putting his boots on, actually, and a young neighbour walked in with a rifle and shot him in front of his wife. He then turned and shot the wife, and then he walked up to her. I think he shot her in the heart and walked up to her and then shot her in the head to make sure she was dead. Then he went over to the husband and hacked at him with a machete to kill him. And the eldest daughter, was in the house. She was a young teenager. She jumped out of a window, and he didn't seem to have a lot of interest in touching her, but she jumped out anyway. He'd got out of the house and shot holes in the water tank, killed the goat, killed the dog, and then took to the bush. We were called up and we spoke to the eldest daughter, and then I got her and we got the two younger girls off the school bus, brought them back to the house, the part of the house that we could go into, sat them down in a bedroom, and I sat down with them and told them that their parents were killed. And the youngest one asked whether the dog had been hurt. You know, innocence. They don't sort of get the full impact, I suppose, and ask those sorts of questions. But, it stayed with me because it was a very, very difficult thing to do. And they had family that were able to comfort them elsewhere, and I didn't see them again, in fact. And the young fellow that had caused the problem in the first place was in the bush. We went in every day for 2 weeks, every day up in the helicopter, every day beating the bush, knowing full well that he was armed in there, and we were going in to try and flush him out. At some stage, we had to give it up. I knew from information I had that he thought that if you ever were searched for by the police, you would outlast them, stay in there until they give up. And we had to give up. I think it was 16 days, 15 days. And eventually, one of his relatives found his body laying across a car. He shot himself. And we were able to have the blowfly infestation of the body brought up to fruition, and so that we could identify exactly when he died. From the two infestations of maggots in the body, were able to tell us that he died on a particular day, which was the day after we'd given up the search. He'd obviously thought we weren't going to give it up, and he'd killed himself. So that brought that to a crashing end. But it was a nasty, nasty business.
He was the neighbour of the husband and wife that he murdered. What was the motive? Was that ever established?
No, the best we could do was that we knew that he's obviously disturbed, but he'd also, there was a possibility of drug issues, but he had gone to a bathroom cabinet and taken every tablet that was in there. Why, I don't know, but, he was just disturbed, obviously. But there was no incident that led to it.
And to put, I guess, it into context, Bell at the time, probably still to this day, you could almost describe it as a regional sort of a very small area outlying Sydney. It's as the crow flies. It's probably an hour and a half, almost a 2-hour drive out of Sydney up to Bell.
Yeah. It's a hamlet.
It's on Bellsliner Road, is it?
Yeah, but this was off that a bit, and
right.
It was there were half a dozen houses. It made it very. We believed that he was coming up to his grandmother's place of a night and being fed. But we couldn't sit off the place because it was just so open. There was no way we could do normal observations. So it was a difficult terrain, and the bush was as rough as, and it was bitterly cold. But it taught me that we had flies up in that area, blowflies up in that area that lived on carrion all through winter, which was interesting, and that's what led us to get to an entomologist and have them bred up and work out when he actually killed himself. But, it was just in case people are wondering why there were blowflies around in the cold weather, but they do exist there.
And they were able to be as accurate as saying that he took his life on this day at this time, roughly, and you're able to conclude from that was the day after. I think you said 16 days that the police devoted sort of resources and everything to it. But as you say, you can't just keep doing that forever and ever.
Well, that's right. And I knew that the gestation period, if that's the right term for insects, I'm not sure, but they knew that they hatched at that particular time, and then you backdate that by the number of days that it takes, and then there were 2 infestations, so you go back further with the first infestation. The body was in very good condition too because it was so cold.
And the young girls involved, so 3 sisters?
Yes.
One at home at the time, and she flees from the house, she escapes from him, and 2 littler ones that you got off the school bus coming home from primary school. How old were these kids? Oh,
I think one was 7, one maybe 9 from memory.
And then the older one, a young teenager?
Very young teenager, yeah.
You don't have contact, obviously, with as you move through the police with victims of these terrible crimes. Very rare for that to occur. There must be a part of you wonders, how those girls ended up and where they...
Yeah, I did hear things from time to time. They went to other family, of course, and out of my area, and I'd hear things. It's not always the case that you lose immediate contact. I had another homicide that I was doing, a child that was killed, and that family I had very close connection with over quite a long time, and it took 9 months to get any result from the investigations. It was a very, very difficult job. But we got someone and charged him, and he got a life sentence. There are others that were never dealt with because we lacked the evidence. But so it was 9 months after the incident. That was in 1987, and naturally you're in touch with the family all the time. You're always visiting, you're always seeing them and supporting. And with major, you probably know this, with major investigations, high-profile investigations, you get every rat bag on earth comes out of the woodwork and makes allegations, all sorts of dreadful allegations about all sorts of things, including the family. So they needed support there as well because they were I suppose they're trolls in today's internet, That went on for a long while, and then after the trial, they moved away from the house, of course, and I moved on to other positions. I think it was probably 2 years later I was promoted rapidly to commission rank, went back into uniform as a commissioned officer.
Alan, you get to that rank, there's a percentage of that work where it's you liaising between the area that you're commanding and the media, of course, and high-profile cases such as the political assassination. Goodness me, there would have been no shortage of media obligations, both television, radio, print media. What's it like to be sort of almost, I guess, suddenly cast into the limelight as a police officer? Or, 5 minutes ago you're a constable, now here you are, you've got the media in front of you. Does that make the job harder? Can you use the media to your advantage? How does that work?
No, I was a bit of a tart. I sucked it
you
up.
didn't mind it.
But I'd done quite a lot of it, actually, because of the cases I've been involved in. But previously, as a detective sergeant, I was in charge of a homicide investigation at Blacktown of a little girl that was murdered, 5-year-old girl, and that was a very, very difficult case. We just couldn't get any traction. And I went on television, the morning television shows, I can't remember what they're called in the day, but I went on to those often. And all of the time that I did that, I was asking the community to help us without actually saying that. I was saying, somebody out there knows what's happening. And that came to pass. We got it. And that's another story in itself because it was quite interesting how it happened. But I fronted every chance I got. I had a child. My youngest child was the same age as that little girl that was killed. It was a very difficult job to do, but I got out and did it. I did a lot of television. I did a lot of papers. I did a lot of radio. And I got up and I faced the media every opportunity I got. I understood what they needed, and they understood what I needed, and we worked very well together. Same at Blacktown with the murder investigation I was doing there. I worked with the media. I knew what they had. They had deadlines. They had to feed their machines and whatever, and I needed to get the word out there as well. When I arrested 3 people for the murder of that child, 2 of whom walked after being charged twice, they still walked because I couldn't hold the evidence that we had. Somebody talking to us and wouldn't keep doing it. But it was all night. We're interviewing these people, these men, and I had all these business cards from different journalists from different media, all the television stations, all the newspapers, the Sun and the Mirror in the day, and, the papers that existed at that time. I got all their business cards out. I got my people together and I gave them a couple of cards each, and I said, hit the phones now and tell all of these people that we've got this happening. So they all got an equal bite at it. I understood what their role was.
Alan, your storied career, goodness me, 34 years. We could probably sit here for a week and go through some, situations that you've been in and the impact that they've had and what have you. But there's one that it's going back a while, but the Granville train disaster of 1977. Now, to put this into context, this was a bridge collapse from memory. 83 people killed in this accident, which makes it a major incident. I'm just going to get you to walk us through that. And I note here that just in my research that this is a train that you yourself took, just to show how close to home that whole thing was.
Yeah, so it was a train that I caught to work on a normal shift. And that day I wasn't on that shift. I had to start earlier. And we got a call that there was a bridge down on the train, and we rushed down to that, drove down the footpath actually to get there, and just assumed it was the footbridge. When we got there, of course, it was the road bridge, and it had gone down onto 2 carriages. Realising what train it was, I was concerned. I knew my wife was dropping neighbours down to the train, and they caught that train often as well. And so I went under the bridge, and I was concerned that I would find them there. But she dropped them off early, and they'd caught an earlier train, so they weren't on it. But I wouldn't have seen them anyway because the carriages were that flattened that you could see people, the sides of them and whatever, and some of the faces, but you couldn't have made out who they were, really.
When we look at a disaster like the Granville train crash there, it's a job where all emergency services attend. You've got fireys, you've got ambos, and you've got the police. Just for the listeners, can you describe what the role is for the police specifically? We know the ambulance role. We know the fireys are there to assist with, moving carriages and all that type of thing. What is the role of the police in those initial interactions at a scene like that?
The role is historical. It's preservation of life and property, primarily. It's also a case that when a person suffers death by violent or unnatural means, that the police become involved and investigate for the coroner. So there's a clear role there.
And just on that, just to circle back around to conclude this, what was the conclusion of the coroner with result? It was a collapsed bridge. Was there any fault attributed to anything engineering or anything such as that, or was it just a terrible act of misadventure, an accident?
Lack of maintenance on the track, lack of maintenance on the locomotive. The wheels had some wear, but the spikes that hold the rail down to the sleepers had worn an elliptic shape around the holes that hold them, that with the movement it had worn them, so it allowed the rails to spread. There was no blame attributed to the driver at all, and there shouldn't have been either, but he was totally innocent. He was driving the train normally in accordance with the rules, and as he went around a slight bend, the rail spread, the wheels came off, and the locomotive hit the stanchions that were holding the bridge up, and down it came. First 2 carriages got through. Second and third carriages were largely crushed. The back of carriage 2, I think, missed being crushed, but might have been the front of carriage 1. I'm not sure now, but 1.5 carriages basically were crushed.
In so much as a major disaster, as I said, 83 people killed. This was the likes of which probably hadn't been seen within Australia before. An incident of this nature.
No, not since wartime, perhaps, but it was. The old morgue at Sydney, it was a new morgue then, but it was the old one now, but it was designed to accommodate victims of an airline crash. So it had a lot of facility there for bodies. We didn't have 83 to start with because there were people still trying to survive, but There were quite a number. And then the normal intake, so there would have been in excess of 100 bodies there, which is something to be confronted by. And then having to take loved ones around and look at each one, pull each one out on the gurney and view them to see whether that was the one that they thought it might have been. But yeah, it was very, very confronting for them. Not so much for me because I'd been through it, but not to that magnitude, you know.
Coming up, how police deal with the impact of crime, dealing with horrific events.
Alan, having a chat to you recently, you're very experienced like yourself, and this sort of thing came out, and you were talking a little bit about informing next of kin and being involved with fatals and things such as that. It's an awful job, but it's one that there's an element where you need to or have the capacity to switch off to it, but there's also, most would say, it's one of those jobs that if you feel that you can do it to the best of your ability, you can make what is a horrendously terrible situation for people. You might not be making it any better per se, but there's a professional element of what you've got to do in a way that you've got to do it. You can sort of take something from that, yeah?
Yeah, and I mean, you can still do your job professionally. I mean, you can still use empathy as well as you need to do. In that instance, in that particular disaster, at least we didn't have the surprise of knocking on the door and telling people that there was an understanding that there was a possibility that their loved one would be there. So that sort of eased that part of it. But it was devastating for them, and some of them who lost multiple family members. I remember one chap who lost both his children and his in-laws, and I remember talking to him as he was sitting there waiting for the weight to be taken off the carriage to discover that actuality. So, yeah, nasty stuff.
How long did it take to clear that scene and, you know, that day-to-day sort of hour-to-hour involvement with the police? How long did that whole process take?
That took days and days. I can't remember the exact time now, but there was a lot of heavy machinery brought in. There was the jibs, and cranes and things. And that had to be done carefully. There was an issue with the train carriage itself that had LPG gas bottles on board, which they kept for heating during winter up in the Blue Mountains. It came from Mount Victoria, that train, right up on the top of the mountain. So they needed to heat the trains that way in those days. So they started to leak. They had to have spray onto those, and there were issues with people who were trapped but still alive, and once they were released, they died because of the crush syndrome that was little understood at that time. So I can't remember the number of days, but it was several days before we got all the people out.
When you go through something like that, Alan, as a police officer, and again, I'm asking this because, you know, folks listening in, I think they'd probably have a genuine interest. The impact that something like that has, how would you describe that? And I mean that in so much as that after you've gone through something like that, it's a terrible thing to have to go through, but I guess it also steels you for other things that you can come up against in your career moving forward, because you're not going to be back in a situation like that again. It's at another level. Well,
you hope you're not going to be in another situation like it, but I'd been in situations before with fatalities and murders and things like that, and homicides, and you get conditioned without being hardened. But once again, you're very aware. I mean, I joined the police cadet corps at 17 years of age and studied for 2 years before I was sworn in at 19, but you're given a gun, a baton and a handcuffs and sent out to work. Every day you get confronted with something, you don't know what's going to happen. So you do get conditioned, and it's up to you whether you become super hardened or whether you take each case separately, as I believe I did. Because that happened, you're not going to assume that there's going to be another one tomorrow. You just get on with the things that you need to do. We were getting pretty well hammered in the city area of Sydney, down near Circular Quay. I was stationed there and in plain clothes as a trainee detective, and decided one day to go out in mufti, basically. Went out and just kept my eyes open with some others and to see whether we could address this. We were getting dozens of cars broken into every day, and I went down and I was near Observatory Hill and saw this car drive down with a young Aboriginal man driving it. And I suppose your bias at that time makes you interested. So I stopped him and spoke to him, and he was beautifully spoken. He had a lovely voice, lovely mellifluous voice, and very well spoken indeed, and very polite. His storyline wasn't particularly strong, particularly as I could see property in the back seat of the car. But anyway, I arrested him and took him back to the station, and he had an amazing memory. We could go through each report of a theft from a motor vehicle, and he could remember the prefix of the number plates, or the numbers, either one or the other, not the whole lot. He'd remember the colour of the car, what type of car it was. Yes, I did that one. No, I didn't do that one. Yes, I did that one. I don't know how many I charged him with. There was dozens of them. I don't know whether he was given up by the family or whether he'd lost his family or whether he was stolen, as we say. He didn't sort of elaborate on that, but he did say that he was, and he was obviously a tribal Aboriginal. He was very much a traditional Indigenous man, a renter, I would assume. And he said that his parents were anthropologists. They'd taken him back to Adelaide, went to Scotch College and was well educated. He had a foot in two worlds and he didn't belong to either of them. And a very, very cruel thing. And it happened all too much, as we know. And he was alcoholic. He lived by stealing because he didn't have any other way to live. And he went to jail, so you know he's going to go to jail, you know he's going to dry out in jail, you know he's going to get out and he's going to offend again, and no doubt that happened. But years later, after my 17 years in plain clothes and not having worn a uniform for many years, I was thrust into commission rank wearing a uniform again and feeling very strange. And I was in the city, I think I might have been in there for court. I was walking down Pitt Street. It would have been 88, 89, and I was walking down Pitt Street and I saw him and I recognised him, and he recognised me and he said, "Oh, Mr. Leek," he said, "I've seen you a lot on television." And I said, "Yes, Charlie." His name was Charlie Apmar. I said, "Charlie, yes, I've been on TV too much lately." It was one of the murder investigations, I think. And we were at the old Congregational Church in Pitt Street. So we sat down on the steps. I was in uniform. He was there. He was sober, but he sat down and we had a chat. And as I was chatting to him, a man walked past and looked across and he said, "Lock him up, Constable." And I was aghast. I mean, I've seen lots of things and I've been in lots of situations, and I thought, what precipitated that comment? And I've always remembered it. And he looked at me and I looked at him and I thought, "You mongrel, what do you say?" I didn't say anything to him, but I thought, I've never been offended by being called a constable, no matter what rank I was, because, in effect, you were still a constable, as you know. You're always a constable. That's your office. Your rank's another thing. So I wasn't offended by that, but I was offended in telling me to lock him up because he was black. Not because he'd done anything, but because he was black. So it stuck with me and it sort of moulded my thinking on all of that sort of thing.
Alan, look, I just want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us here today. Alan, it's always such a pleasure for me to sit here and chat with either past or present police. I mean, you're 34 years experience, and as we said before off air, goodness, we could sit here for a week and listen to some of the wonderful stories and circumstances and situations that you've been in. Thank you for your candour. Thanks for, it's that old school style of policing. It's just wonderful to hear, and also interesting to me that with all the work that you did and all the high-profile cases that you worked on, I think there's something very honourable about you wanting to articulate that experience with Charlie and that arrest and those interactions and how that has stayed with you. And it's often those simple interactions and those people that you meet, they're the things that will often stay with you longer than many of the others.
Very much so. And the other thing that struck me in my career was those that had come before me, particularly the men in the 40s who were my experience with people I worked for, my bosses and whatever. They'd been servicemen and they'd joined the police and they'd seen action at the front, they'd seen action in the police. I thought, these people, we need to look at these people, look at the true stories of their deaths, and that's why I started to write about it. I start in 1901 and I go through the police that are slain across the country, and because they served as in the army and in other services, survived and was cut down in their own country, and the way it is, it's sad, but they trod the path for us to excel, and I hope that my generation did too, to set an example for those that followed.
I've no doubt, Alan, that you've set a wonderful example for those younger folks following through. And I'd say with absolute sincerity, I want to thank you so much for your service and for your candour here today. And it's always such a great pleasure to chat. And I'm sure that many of those who listen in will take a lot from this discussion. And thanks for your time.
Thanks, Brent.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound designed by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.